Hey crafty friends, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing 2 watercolor cards using this beautiful Nativity Peace, Love, Hope stamp set from Maker Forte. I absolutely love how each of these sentiments, there is a little mini manger nativity scene hidden in them. Absolutely gorgeous. I have 2 pieces of 140-pound cold pressed watercolor paper cut down just kind of to a random size, but definitely larger than my desired finished card size. So to start, this video is slightly longer than my usual one, so my apologies in advance for that. So to start our cards today, I am going to adhere my watercolor panel down to an MDF board that I normally use for watercolor painting. I just took 2 pieces of painter's tape, stuck it down to my clothes for a few seconds first, just to kind of remove any excess stickiness. Just so they're sticky enough to adhere my paper down, but not so much so that they tear the paper when you remove the tape from the paper. For each of our cards, we're going to be using 2 different colors of paint. The first one that we are doing is going to be red, so I grab a red and a carmine red. The red is slightly lighter than the carmine red, so that is the one that we're going to be starting with first. I have a jar of clean and clear water that I'm going to be using, as well as a flat brush that I always used when I do watercolor backgrounds. And I have a paper towel set to the side. So now I just prop my board up so it's on a slight angle, just with an ink pad. And I get started. So now I just take some clean water at first and I just brush it all over the watercolor paper to kind of saturate it first. We are doing a wet on wet method, because that's the one that I find works best for me and is most easiest for me rather than wet and dry. And when you're doing an ombre wash like this, I find it is a lot easier when you are going into a wet piece of paper. So to do the ombre pretty much means that it goes from dark to light. So I am concentrating most of the paint at the top of my paper and then just fading out to the bottom with some water. So after every time that I apply more paint, I go back in and add some more water to it, just so we have a nice smooth transition going from light to dark, and it is blended really nicely. Now, when you're doing a technique like this, I am a firm believer that the quality of the watercolor paper makes a huge difference. As you'll see, I'm adding a lot of paint and even more water to my watercolor panel, to my paper, but it does not warp the paper, it does not distort it, nothing. It is as perfect as it was when I went in when it was dry, as you can see there. Absolutely perfect. So if you can invest in a slightly pricier watercolor paper, I highly recommend it, especially for techniques like this. So now that first layer that we did was our base layer. So once I was happy with that, I set it to the side to dry completely. And then we went back in with our darker color, doing the exact same method, wetted it first, and then started going in with the paint, concentrating at the top and going lighter at the bottom. I wanted to darken up the red just slightly, so I added a little bit of black paint to it just to deepen it up ever so slightly. And then just continued on doing the same method, adding paint, fitting it towards the bottom, adding water to blend it all and make it a nice smooth transition from light to dark until I was happy with it all, with how it looked, and then I just set it to the side to dry completely on its own. Patience is usually not one of my virtues, so I would normally go in with a heat tool to speed up the process a bit, but I behaved this time and I did not. I let it dry naturally on its own and it turned out great. So now for our second panel, we are doing blue. I used a menthol violet, which really is, to me it looked completely blue, not violet at all. And then the deeper blue that I use is called deep blue. So I just went in doing the exact same process, wet the paper at first, and then went in with my lighter color for our base layer, concentrating most of the color at the top and fading out towards the bottom. Again, adding more water after every time I added more paint to smoothen it and make a nice soft blend. And I just kept going back and forth until I was happy with how that looked. And again, lots of water, lots of paint added to it, but the paper remained perfect. It did not pill up at all from all of the water on it. Definitely invest in good paper, like I said, if you can afford to. If not, then just get the best paper that your budget allows. So I just set that to the side to let it dry naturally on its own, and then went back in with our second layer of the darker deep blue. Now this deep blue is an absolutely beautiful blue. It's kind of like an indigo blue. It's really pretty. So I just did the exact same method, started going dark at the top, fading out to light at the bottom, adding more water, and just kept going back and forth until I was happy with how it looked. And again, this panel as well, I did not help to speed up the process whatsoever with a heat tool. I just let them both completely dry on their own naturally. Because as well, if you go in heat with a heat tool, it will start to warp your paper a bit, and I want to try to minimize that as much as possible, because we are going to be doing some heat embossing after these were all finished. So now these are my two panels. Once they are dry, you can see that there is very little, there's a teeny tiny little bit of warping, but very little whatsoever. So we are going to be doing some paint splatters on both of these. For the red, I chose a gold, and on the white, I chose a white gold, which is closest to the colors that I want to stay with for the blue, which is blue and silver. So I just grab my board again to do my splattering on. I add a little bit of water to the paint pan to hydrate it a bit. And I just go in with a small paintbrush and just start tapping my finger on the brush. This is the method that I find works best for me when it comes to paint splatters. Other people have other techniques as well, but this is the one that I use that I find works the best for me. I also sometimes go in with an acrylic stamping block, which you will see that I do grab that in a minute just to see if it made much of a difference, excuse me. But I found that just the tapping the paintbrush with my finger works the best for me, and that's the way that I prefer. So I just add a little bit more to it until I was happy with how it looked, and I set that to the side to dry. Now these panels with the paint splatters, they don't take long at all to dry, maybe 5-10 minutes at the very most. So now for my red panel, I grabbed a blue gold metallic paint, sorry, yes. And I just go and do the exact same thing. Now with this one, I got slightly larger splatters, which I absolutely love as well. There's a nice mixture of large, medium, and small little itty bitty splatters on this. Love them all. So yeah, so I just keep tapping until I was happy with it, and then I just set it aside to dry with the blue one. So once they're all dry, I am actually going to be trimming them down. Now when I have panels with this, when I want to use a certain area, sorry, first I'm going to be using the peace sentiment on the blue panel and the love on the red. I thought they went perfect with it. So when I have a panel like this where I only want to use a certain area, but I die cut it first so I can pick the general area that I want to use, and then I trim it down to the desired size after that. It just makes it a lot easier than just trying to guess with your paper trimmer exactly where you want to cut it down. With the die cut, at least you can place it and you can see exactly where you want to, which area you want to use. So I do the same. The blue one I did horizontally, and the red one I'm going to do vertically. So we have the two different orientations for them. Just make them just slightly different. So I just cut down both of my panels using the die cut. And then I trim down the two die cut panels to my desired size of 3.75 by 5 inches. So I just trim off a quarter of an inch off of each 4 of the tops and the sides. And as well, don't throw out those scraps that you have from die cutting. You can use those to cut out little shapes. You can use them to cut out words, and they're such a beautiful watercolor piece with those paint splatters. You don't want to waste them by throwing them in the garbage. Always save them if they're big enough to be used. So yeah, so here I am just cutting a quarter of an inch from each side, so they, like I said, so they work out to be a finished size of 3.75 by 5 inches. I love having that little bit of a bigger white border around my finished card. I just find it yeah, it just, to me, it's more aesthetically pleasing to me. Sometimes I do a little less of a border, sometimes I do that, but I love it. So those are my two panels, and I'm going to be doing some heat embossing. So I grabbed my Misty, and definitely on a watercolor paper you want to use something like this because it is a textured paper, and this paper that I use is actually quite textured. I will need to stamp the image, ink up the image and stamp it. I think I did it 3 or 4 times. So I placed the stamp exactly where I wanted it on my watercolor panel, and then I prepped my panel with some anti-static powder tool, and for this one I'm going to be using a metallic silver embossing powder. So I ink up my stamp using the Color Hive clear ink embossing pad, and I grab my smoocher, which this thing is fantastic for getting a nice even pressure on your stamp. So I take it out just to see if it stamped out well, and it did, but because, like I said, this is a textured watercolor paper, I do that about 3 times altogether, maybe 4, I cannot remember. So, and as well, the magnets and it helps to keep your paper in place so it doesn't move, so you get the stamped image in the exact same place every single time. So once I was done, I add my embossing powder to it and set it to the side until the red one is done, so I can just heat them both up at the same time. And so I just place the next one for the red panel, the love sentiment, on the front exactly where I want that, and I just do the exact same as I did for the first one. Prep my paper using some anti-static powder so I don't have a whole bunch of little stray bits of embossing powder all over. Although if I did, it is gold that I'm using, so it would just kind of blend in with the paint splatters, but I still want it to be as clean of an embossed image as I could possibly get. So prep it up there, and I again stamped it using the Color Hive clear embossing ink pad, and I believe again I did that the same about 3 or 4 times to get a nice inked impression, because like I said, it is watercolor paper, and the texture of the paper makes it harder to get a good stamped image than you would on a nice smooth cardstock. So I just keep going back in, inking it up, and then I add my fine detail gold embossing powder to it. Now my embossing powders that I use more often, I have them in these big containers. It makes it really easy. So yeah, so there we go, we have that, and I just go, and I have a few bits of embossing powder that were where they should not have been. So I just go in with a paintbrush, a fine tip paintbrush, and I just clean them up, no biggie. So I went in and I heated up my heat tool for maybe about 25-30 seconds. So it was nice and hot to, like I said, minimize as much warping of the paper as we could from the heat. And then I just went in and melted that powder. Now, looking back on these, I should have maybe tried to go back and heat emboss it a second time, so I would get a nice smooth embossed image, because the texture of the paper did come through the embossing powder, but they still turned out beautiful. I'm not that concerned about it. But I absolutely love the shine of the embossing powder. It's absolutely fantastic. So now to kind of just finish off the edge of the cards and give it a another nice little detail, I just run the edges of my cards along the ink pad, the Color Hive clear ink embossing pad, just to kind of finish it off along the edge. And then I just add the embossing powder, the exact same embossing powder that I used for the sentiment to the inked up edges, and just heated that back up. And as you can see, it just adds a nice little detail and just finishes them off perfectly. And it just ties in with the gold splatters and the gold embossing from the sentiment as well. A nice little detail that adds. And then I just do the exact same thing that I did for the red, but I do it on the blue. Now this time I got a slightly wider edge, I guess if that makes sense, along with the ink once I added the embossing powder. So I just went in with the brush because I didn't want the embossing to be that much on the sides of it. So I just went in with the brush and just kind of brushed off any excess powder that I didn't want, because I wanted just to be along the edges of it. And so yeah, so I just cleaned it up a bit along each of the edges where there was a little bit too much powder, and I just went back in and heat embossed this one as I did with the red. So to finish off the cards, I added some foam dots to each of them and adhered them to my A2 side folding card. I did that off camera because I didn't think you'd want to see it. And then I just finished off the cards with some solar flare gems on the red one from Maker Forte and just some plain old crystal ones on the blue one. And that is it. These are my finished cards. I absolutely love how they turned out, and I hope that you love them just as much as I do. Thank you so very much for joining me today. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and until next time, have a great day. Bye.